Hello. Those of you that tuned in the last time found out that the Great Plains, the development of the economy in the Great Plains was very much tied into some of the things that we were seeing happening in the Midwest and the Northeast. And probably the best example that I can give you when it comes to the interconnectedness of the American economy is the cattle industry right here in Texas. We really begin to see a takeoff of that when the Missouri Central Railroad reaches into Fort Worth, and all of a sudden you now have a feasible way to get that cattle from Texas all the way up to Chicago, where Jurgis Rudkiston turned it into processed food. The economy that we're going to be talking about in the West Coast, the far West, is going to be quite similar in that respect. There's going to be things that the far West is producing that are very much coveted back in the East, and you'll see an interconnectedness to this the same way that we have with the Great Plains. So, without further ado, let me explain something. Whereas it was agriculture that really stimulated the economy of the Great Plains, it's the mining industry that really stimulated the economy of the far West. Mining for what? I want you to think about California. One of the things that really puts California on the map, probably the thing that puts it on the map in the 1840s and early 1850s, that would be the mining for gold. When gold is discovered in the late 1840s, all of a sudden what you see is California's population boom with the gold rush. And you have all these prospectors that are running out to California, and they're just snatching up territory. They're literally staking their claims. The problem is they're really only equipped to mine for gold on the surface levels. In other words, they're panning for gold. What they're doing is they're putting a pan out there in the river, a stream, and if a gold nugget, a chunk kind of unearths itself and makes its way into the pan, that's really the only way that they have to get at the deposits of the gold. Now think about it. What is it that you really need to get after the main deposits? You need things like heavy industrial equipment. You need a lot of workers. You need other things like dynamite and other digging tools that are going to help you to unearth some of these things. So the bottom line is, what you're going to see in the mining industry relatively early on are all these prospectors that had gone out there to stake their claim. They're going to quickly sell out to the corporate interests, and what you're going to see is a corporate takeover of the mining industry. Now, when these corporations go out there looking for gold, they inevitably find other precious metals and minerals that are very useful and very valuable back in the East. Of course, I'm talking about things like lead and copper, things that were very useful as far as industry is concerned, zinc in places like New Mexico. You've got other things sort of like silver and aluminum and all of iron ore, all of these other metals that are very conducive to industry back in the East. So the same way that you're going to see the development of crops like corn or wheat or livestock like cattle, and there's an interconnectedness there. There's an interconnectedness to the mining industry in the far West. Okay. Now, what you should also understand about the mining industry is it's very similar to those jobs that we've been talking about back in the East, similar to the things that Jurgis Rudkis is taking. They're backbreaking in terms of their labor intensity. They're dangerous. They don't pay particularly well, and consequently, it's generally going to be immigrants that are going to be taking these jobs. Before we talk about immigration, let me talk about something else. San Francisco would not have been possible had it not been for the Pacific Slope. Now, what is the Pacific Slope? Generally speaking, I'm talking about the northwestern part of what is now the United States, so Washington State and Oregon, right? And if you think about the topography, the environment in that part of the country, very, very green, and one of the things that you really can't, or at least I can't not think about, would be those massive redwood trees. It's the lumber of the Pacific Slope. It's the fish. It's the cattle. It's the food crops of the Pacific Northwest, the Pacific Slope, that's really feeding the mining economy of California, San Francisco in particular. It was the material that was being harvested in the Pacific Slope that's being sent south to places like San Francisco that's making urban living possible in the first place. Now, if you remember the last time, I asked you to think about the land as it relates to populations before the development of industry. Were there people that were living on the Great Plains before, big agriculture came along? And of course there were. There was the Sioux Nation, as we found out. Well, just like the Sioux, there were an indigenous group of people that were living in the far western part of what is now the United States, and that group of people would have been Mexican nationals. Now, to get you to understand what I'm talking about here, in 1848, the United States and Mexico go to war for a lot of different reasons, none of which are overly important for this class, but what is important is the end of the war. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, what this does in the late 1840s is it ends the U.S.-Mexican War, and it also forces Mexico to give the United States what you think of as the southwestern part of the U.S. Of course, I'm talking about California, but I'm also talking about South Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, and a very large portion of Colorado. Now, when the Mexican government went ahead and did this, one of its primary concerns is what would happen to those individuals that were living in that part of the country before the United States had annexed it. Well, what the United States says, and this is again part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, is as long as they stay put for at least 1 year, they will be full members of American society, including U.S. citizens. Now, this is a big deal for a number of different reasons, but one of the things that I'd like you to understand here is along with citizenship comes specific rights that are supposed to be guaranteed to be protected under the U.S. Constitution, including land rights. We have to understand that the U.S.-Mexican War in the East was seen almost as open season on Mexican territory in the West, and there were a lot of people that had been eyeballing that territory in the West and just kind of chomping at the bit to colonize it, basically. So essentially what you see are these squatters, these Anglo squatters that are coming out to the West and simply claiming what heretofore had been Mexican territory. Now, think about it. If you've ever had to go to court, you'll know that there's very few things that are inexpensive about that, and not even the parking itself is inexpensive. Going to court was very expensive, and the people that we're talking about of the Mexican variety, they were classified as rich, but what you really meant was they were landowners. They had quite a bit of land, but not a whole lot of liquid cash. Well, think about it. If you don't have a whole lot of money laying around, and you want to settle a legal fee, one of the ways that you can do that is by simply offering up the land. And that's what a lot of Mexican nationals, now U.S. citizens, begin doing. Okay? So little by little, what you're seeing is the erosion, very important, the erosion of Mexican-American land ownership in the Southwest. More and more, you are seeing these U.S. corporate interests gobbling up land, and more Mexican Americans being forced to make a decision how to support the family. And a lot of times what that means is working for the railroad, working for the mining company, taking these heavy industrial jobs that we've been talking about. And for a variety of reasons, many of which we've talked about, this tends to lead to poverty, which leads to institutionalized inequality. Okay? So please keep in mind, there's very, very few things in history that are completely random. Inequality in the late 19th century is certainly something that would qualify as such. There's a very specific rhyme and reason to all of this. Now, as I've mentioned before, the industrialization of the far west, just like in the East, could not have been possible without a massive onslaught of immigration. But the people that we're going to talk about from the West, we've not really talked about in this class before. Whereas in places like New York and Chicago, you had people from southeastern Europe that were coming over, taking these heavy industrial jobs. It's generally going to be people from Latin America and Asia that are going to come over and fill the labor void in the West, work on the railroads, work in the mining industry. Let me begin with Latin America. We're talking about a very tumultuous, chaotic time period in Mexican history. I mean, it's the beginning of the Mexican Revolution, and this is going to displace a lot of people. So there's a lot of people that are on the move from the Mexican variety during this time period, and one of their destination points is the United States. Now, just like with Ellis Island, there is a processing element to immigration, and the processing point for people of the Latin American variety, that would be El Paso. Okay, so El Paso basically is the checkpoint in the Southwest that thousands of people are going through as it relates to these immigrants that are going to take these jobs in heavy industry. And just like in Ellis Island, this was a very intimidating process, but with another wrinkle added to it. There were Anglo stereotypes and racist assumptions that existed in the late 19th century as it related to people of Latin American variety. Issues involving the cleanliness of these individuals, amongst other things. And so, while things were very, very difficult at Ellis Island, I'm certainly not marginalizing that. I make the case that they were even more difficult in places like El Paso, where people were doused with these cleaning agents as they were going through the gates, simply because of some of these racist assumptions. Now, let me transition into Asian immigration. When you're talking about Asian immigration, really what you're talking about is Chinese immigration. Like Mexico, there's a lot happening in China right now, and a lot of what's going on is pushing people off the land and forcing them to look elsewhere when it comes to their livelihood. Now, for our purposes, it's going to be Angel Island that thousands and thousands, arguably even more than that, of Chinese nationalists are going to be processed in the immigration process. Now, Angel Island is the western version of Ellis Island. It's off the coast of California. And similar to Ellis Island, one of the things that they would do to process you is ask you questions like, do you have a job, and do you have a place to stay, and, are you a member of this radical organization? And if you didn't know the answers to these, it was much more likely that you would be sent back from Angel Island than from Ellis Island. So the point that I'm trying to make here is, even though the immigration process was very, very difficult, traumatic in the East, I would make the case that it's even more so in the West. And certainly Angel Island would qualify as such. Now, just like with the case of Jurgis Rudkis, the people that are going to take these jobs are not only going to suffer from the inequality that exists on the shop floor, meaning workers and bosses, we're also talking about a racist society, okay? Chinese immigration in particular really piques the interest of native-born English-speaking workers more than anybody else, because Chinese immigrants are going to be seen as people that are going to be taking jobs from quote-unquote real Americans. Now, let me talk about those jobs for just a minute. Those jobs are largely railroad jobs, which, let's be honest about something, had Chinese and Mexican workers not been immigrating to the United States, it would not have been possible to, create a transcontinental railroad. So it's not as if they're taking jobs in like the engineering field or technological fields or things of that sort. It's just that they're perceived to be these opportunists, people that are coming over to take advantage of the United States. And if you combine this with these native-born assumptions, many of which were overtly racist, Chinese Americans were treated as second-class citizens. Now, the word xenophobia, we've talked about that word before, this fear of foreigners. Certainly that would have been the case for the Chinese. There are all these assumptions about, what the Chinese immigration process meant and what it meant for native-born Americans. Now, I want to make something else very clear. There is an awful lot of native-born resentment as it relates to Chinese immigration during this time period. And there's a lot of sentiment that's really manifesting itself in political arenas. You couldn't really be elected dog catcher in California, for instance. I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat, if you did not at least pay lip service to the idea of shutting down Chinese immigration. So one of the things that you see emerge during this period is something called the Chinese Exclusion Act. In 1882, what Congress does is basically close the door to future Chinese immigration. Now, for your notes, this is a radical extension of government power, and although the Irish and the Italians and the Poles and the Russians and the Jews, each one of these groups had been the subject of racism, discrimination, and second-class citizenship, up until that point, there had never been a specific law that targeted a specific group of people like this does Chinese immigrants. Okay? So the Chinese Exclusion Act is more or less a result of all of this xenophobic backlash that is taking place because of some of the assumptions on the part of native-born Americans as to what Chinese immigration actually means. There's another dynamic to this as well. We've talked about Jim Crow laws in the East, Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, which really translated into separate and unequal. Chinatown would have been that version in the West. Now, many of us may have visited a Chinatown somewhere in the United States or Canada, and my guess is you probably did a little bit of shopping and had lunch. There's nothing wrong with that, but we've got a very romanticized understanding of what Chinatown was. Back in the 1880s and 90s, what Chinatown in places like San Francisco actually was the only part of town where the native-born population allowed Chinese immigrants to exist. There were laws, both written and unwritten, that said if you were of Chinese descent, you couldn't live here, you couldn't patron this store, you couldn't work in this part of town, you couldn't be seen in various parts of town. So Chinatown is really the representation of Chinese second-class citizenship during this time period in American life. It's another example of institutionalized inequality in the late 19th century. Now, up until this point, we've really been talking about Northern California. I want to transition our examination to Southern California during this period. Now, for much of the 19th century, Southern California was thought of something that was supposed to be avoided. It was a relatively hot climate, arid climate, didn't get a lot of rain, and so therefore a lot of people believed that Southern California wasn't very conducive to a large population, which is kind of silly by our standards because that's one of the most densely populated areas in the country. But one of the things that Southern California had and has a lot of is sunshine. And so what that does is it makes Southern California very, very conducive, lend itself very well to the development of specific kinds of agriculture. In particular, specialty crops like raisins, almonds, peaches, citrus fruits, things that grow very, very well in that part of the United States and not so well virtually anywhere else. Now, anytime you're talking about big agriculture, you're going to need a lot of people to be able to do this heavy lifting. And the simple fact of the matter is, we've just really cut off a very important resource when it comes to inexpensive labor with Chinese immigration. Again, had it not been for the Chinese, there probably is not a Transcontinental Railroad. Okay? Very instrumental part of the industrialization of the United States. So where are these workers going to come from? Because we can make the assumption that native-born Americans are not going to be doing the kind of heavy lifting for the very low wages that people from other parts of the world would be willing to do. The answer is Japan, at least initially. For reasons that are similar to what's happening in China, there's a lot of immigration from Japan at this particular moment. And the same kind of second-class citizenship and xenophobic racism that Chinese immigrants are facing in Northern California, Japanese immigrants are facing the same kind of discrimination in the South. There's unmistakable anti-Japanese sentiments to the extent of there are parts of Los Angeles that they were specifically not welcome. And over the course of time, what you begin to see are the same anti-Japanese sentiments in working-class California that you saw in places like San Francisco with the Chinese. Now, Japan is not China. Japan and China are actually going in two different directions politically and economically. Japan is developing into a first-world nation, very similar to the United States. It's modernizing its military, it's modernizing its economy, and it's really becoming a force to be reckoned with politically. And so the reason that you don't have a Japanese Exclusion Act the same way that you do with the Chinese is Japan basically tells Washington, look, you're not going to make our people the laughingstock of the world the same way that you've done with the Chinese. they were able to put enough political pressure on the United States so that that kind of law never came out to target Japan specifically like it did with China. That being said, it did not stop local businessmen and local town leaders from passing unwritten gentleman agreements that they would not hire Japanese. They would not rent apartments or houses to Japanese. In a lot of instances, what's going on in Southern California is very similar to what's happening in Chicago, for instance, with the black community. When African Americans begin arriving in droves in Chicago, one of the reasons that black-owned businesses begin to thrive, I'm talking about barbershops and funeral parlors and things of that sort, is because the white community simply refused to service them. So it creates a niche in the market, and there's a similar situation that's emerging in Southern California as it relates to Japanese immigration. Let me end with this. We're going to switch gears just a moment, and I want to talk about environmentalism, because that's one of the things that's really gotten lost in this whole process, and I don't care where you're talking about. It could be Chicago, it could be Los Angeles, it could be El Paso, it could be, Birmingham, Alabama, for all I care. What you've got are these massive companies that are ripping into the earth, that are, polluting the air, that are polluting the water, without a whole lot of recourse or even concern as to what's happening. Well, one of the only individuals that really tried to right this ship, so to speak, was a guy by the name of John Muir. Now, let me give you a really easy way to remember John Muir. Muir was America's first tree-hugging hippie, okay? What I mean by that is he was an environmentalist. He was a biologist by trade, and he viewed places like California as this massive natural laboratory. And when industry came in and slashed forests to the ground, right, and dug into mountainsides for things like golds and other precious metals, ripped it apart, they were forever, or at least for a very significant portion of time, altering the environment and really making it to where future generations may not be able to see this kind of thing, study this kind of thing. So one of the things that John Muir did was to put pressure on state and federal authorities to kind of protect various stretches of land. And so one of the things that I'd like you to understand about John Muir is he's one of the founding officials of what would later become known as the Sierra Club. Now, you call these Sierra Club institutions things like state parks of California, so Grant Park, Yosemite, things of that sort. And what John Muir wants to do is to use the powers, the coercive powers of government, be that state or federal, to protect the environment because nobody else is protecting the environment. Now, I'd like to be able to tell you that John Muir fought the good fight and, he won. But as you might imagine, very similar to the Sioux, very similar to the Mexican nationals that were living in the southwestern part of the United States, any time an indigenous population or even institution got in the way of economic progress, 9 times out of 10 it was economic progress that won that fight, that debate, okay? But nonetheless, I think it's noteworthy that people like John Muir are beginning to ask questions, how much economic development is actually no longer beneficial to how we're trying to live, to human life. So with that being said, one of the things that I'd like you to be mindful of as we leave this particular topic in American history is virtually any time you've got an indigenous population and it's standing in the way of economic development and progress, it's generally shoved aside in favor of an expanding economy. I think that you'll see that again and again, and ultimately it's really not going to end until we get well into the 1930s, okay? So at any rate, that's where we're going to leave it for this particular session, and when we come back, we're going to be talking about the crisis on the farm as it relates to rural poverty.